It is my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Bob Horowitz. Dr. Horowitz is a primary care internist and a longtime mediator. He attended Stanford Medical School, did his medical residency at Santa Clara Medical Center in San Jose, and worked there in primary care division for many years. Dr. Horowitz developed a self-compassion training program for physical well-being at the Stanford Prevention Research Center in the Stanford School of Medicine. He teaches mindful self-compassion at El Camino Hospital in Mountain View, California. Please help me welcome Dr. Horowitz to the stage.
It's a pleasure to be here this morning. I have a great love for palliative care providers, and I really like the idea of quality of life. So today, what we're going to be doing is we're going to focus on the quality of your life and how we can make that more wonderful with self-compassion. And by the way, during this talk, we're going to have a couple of reflective writing exercises, so please have a paper and pen handy if you can. And if you can't, don't worry about it, we'll make it through. I do teach a program in self-compassion down the peninsula in Mountain View. So I think we all know that modern life is challenging in some ways. It's frenetic and we're multitasking quite a bit. And then we have these funny things called emotions that can give us a lot of difficulty at times. And of course, we have our fellow travelers on the planet that we bump into. We love them, but they can be a pain for us too. So how do we live well? There's been a lot of interest from psychologists about what some of the aspects of our lifestyle would be that would promote well-being. For example, do we have a positive outlook or not? Are we resilient? Do we rebound quickly from problems, or do we tend to linger with them? How do we care for ourselves, and how do we care for others? Increasingly, well-being is seen not just as the luck of the draw, who your parents or your genes are, but also a skill. And one of the really promising skills is compassion, something we've known for millennia, but actually has had a lot of interest in recent time as well. So let's start with compassion in general. There are a lot of definitions of compassion. In a typical way, compassion would be described as recognizing and being moved by another person's suffering and wanting to help. So we recognize that there's something there. We see that person on the street. Do we stop and actually notice that that person is having a hard time, or we just walk by? We need to recognize it for compassion to actually be initiated. And then we have to be concerned, and concerned enough that it moves us to do something. That's really where compassion comes from. There's a lot of interest in the biology of compassion, and there's so much evidence that compassion comes from precursors in our biological world that are really millions of years old. And for that reason, it's thought that a lot of our nervous system and our bodies in general have evolved to be able to provide care and to make it easy for us to do that. Increasingly, there's evidence that when you are compassionate, not just the one who receives it, but also the one who's giving it benefits in terms of better mental and physical health and better relationships. And finally, compassion is something not only innate, and we see this actually in very young children, but it's also something that can be improved and cultivated through your lifetime, not unlike language. So this is where we come from, this demanding world of ours. It's not the way it looks out there on the Bay Shore, but this is where we've evolved from. We have drives. We got hungry, had breakfast, and we also have threats. We don't want to be somebody's breakfast. So we have our fight, flight, freeze system too. The problem in our modern world is that our emotions, many of them driven by our internal states, our thoughts, something about a job or a relationship, a health issue, these issues play out on these very ancient systems of ours, and they can really wreak havoc. So if we have a kind of overdrive, we might develop addictions. If we have too much threat, we may have problems like anxiety and depression. But fortunately, we have some other systems that are associated with our caregiving capabilities. So we have systems that are oriented towards safety and connectedness, contentment. These systems appear to regulate the drive and threat systems. And basically, what seems to happen, if you imagine a mother bird who's going out to get food for her young, she has to overcome her own hunger to bring the food back to the nest. And she has to overcome the threats of predators to go out and get that food. So we could understand at least why it would make sense that these systems actually help to regulate these other systems which could be problematic. There are specific circuits that are being identified and discovered associated with this caregiving system, and these probably are targets when we do compassion training, and we'll talk a little more about that in a moment. In particular, compassion training seems to improve our positive emotions. It's a very particular way that we seem to be able to regulate emotions. And when we are compassionate, it's a rewarding thing. We want to do more of it. One of the ideas that's related closely to compassion is empathy. We all have different ideas of what empathy is. I think a very simple notion of what empathy is that it gives us an understanding of what's going on inside of other people, our ability to understand what they might be thinking and feeling. It's a guess, but we have a very highly evolved system for making very good guesses. One part of empathy is called affective or emotional empathy. That helps us to actually share the experience of another person. And the way we do that is when I see a person who's in pain, that person's brain has certain areas that are active. And when I see that person, similar areas in my brain become active. I actually understand that person because to some degree, I feel what they are feeling in my own body. Another part of empathy, and these occur within a couple of hundred milliseconds of each other. This second part of empathy is called cognitive empathy. It's our seeing through the other person's eyes, walking in that person's shoes. It's our ability at a conscious level to understand what's going on for somebody else. These two systems use very different networks in the brain. There are other parts of empathy as well, but these are two of the most important parts. So as caregivers, it's important to know that affective empathy, this emotional empathy, the sharing part, is largely automatic. And we're working with people all the time who are in distress. So we're just soaking up negative affect pretty naturally. It could probably explain why we feel drained at the end of the day, and to some degree can explain some of the burnout that happens. Interestingly, though, compassion is quite different. Somehow, in not only recognizing the suffering, which is empathic, but we also feel concerned and moved by it, something very different happens. And there's evidence that compassion training may actually enhance emotion regulation and protect us against empathic distress. In this experiment that was done in Germany, what they saw was that they took two groups. One group they called affective group that learned first empathy and then compassion. They did this over 2 weeks, and they got about 5 hours of training each week. And in the first part, they basically taught people or had people just looking at situations that were emotionally difficult or not, and trying to just feel what the other person felt. In the compassion training, they used what's called love and kindness meditation, where people would use phrases like, may you be happy, may you be safe, may you be well. And then they had a memory group that was learning to improve their memory as a control. During the study, they showed people pictures of either distressing or not distressed faces and asked people what they felt. What they saw was that the empathy training increased people's negative emotional state, even when they weren't looking at the pictures. In the brain, areas that are known to be empathic pain areas were activated, and this was on fMRI studies. After the compassion training, same people, all the negativity biasing that happened with the empathy training went away, and people were more positive even when they saw distressing pictures. In the brain, what they saw was that areas that are associated with love and positive emotions and reward were activated, a very different signature than what they saw with the empathy. In general, we've been seeing, although there are not a lot of studies, that compassion training does something different than other types of emotion regulation. It makes us feel more positive, even in the midst of distressing emotions. We tend to turn towards those emotions, even when we have the option of turning away. That's the interesting thing that's emerging. So compassion training is a very particular way that we could orient towards the difficult conditions of our life. Another part of this is the concept of neuroplasticity. You may know that, of course, we've known for a long time that our brain creates our mental states, but as well, we're beginning to know that our mental states change our brain structure. There's this notion that neurons that fire together, wire together, they become more efficient at functioning together in groups, and experience and practice can change brain structure. So there's a little about when we exercise our brains through things like meditation, or it could be something like playing the piano. These things will change the brain structure. I think an important part of compassion, an important part of that story, is that compassion has a certain ecology. We want to see not just our own, we may be soldiers in the army of compassion, and we may be giving out compassion, but we want to be sure that we also fill our own tanks. We've got to be sure that we're on the receiving end of compassion as well. And compassion is something that's actually all around us. We feel the care of other people, many of whom we never see, that create a building or make the food that we eat. We also have the ability to give ourselves compassion. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. But this notion that we also receive compassion as well as giving it so that we can maintain a kind of healthy balance. As well, we want to also have compassion not only coming from the head, but from the heart. I think in medicine we learn a lot about a certain emotional distancing, and maybe the idea that, well, we can understand people, but we also want to feel for them because we will feel for them whether we want to or not. And if we can do that more consciously and more skillfully, it will work a lot better. The heart and the brain go hand in hand. This notion that love is all around, and one way to build compassion for the world and from the world is through practices like gratitude, where we really recognize what we're being given. So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about self-compassion in particular. Self-compassion is really about befriending ourselves. It's a simple thing, but it's a very radical notion for many of us. So self-compassion is simply giving ourselves the same kindness that we would give to others. Do unto yourself as you would do unto others, a kind of a reverse golden rule. There's a research scientist named Kristen Neff who's done a lot of the pioneering work on self-compassion, and she's distinguished a few basic elements. First of all, we have to recognize when we're suffering. If we come out of that exam room or that hospital room and we're feeling really upset about something, do we notice that? Wow, this is really hard for me. Or do we just skip over and try to fix or blame or find some way away from that distress? If we don't actually contact or touch the distress at some level, very hard to have compassion for ourselves. Also, we're not alone in the way we feel. Whatever we feel, we're feeling things that other people have felt. As human beings, we're imperfect, we're vulnerable, we screw up. That's the way it is. And absolutely every one of us has experienced that. We're not alone in that moment, and we certainly don't want to feel isolated. And third, self-kindness. May I be okay with what's going on? If I make a mistake, can I learn from this? Could I accept myself as I am? Or at least could I begin to accept myself as I am? These three elements then comprise a way of not only defining self-compassion, but a way of accessing it in a moment of difficulty, to really just go through these steps. So I'd like to do an exercise right now. This is a good time to get your paper and your pen if everybody has something like that. And I'd like you to go ahead and just sit in a way that lets you feel alert and comfortable. And please go ahead and close your eyes fully or partially. You might just take a few slow, easy breaths. Now I'd like you to think about a time when a close friend was suffering in some way. Maybe they had some kind of misfortune, a failure. Maybe they felt inadequate. Maybe something about school or work, something about a relationship, some other life situation. How would you typically respond to your friends in such situations? What would you say to that person? What would be the tone of your voice? Maybe what kind of gestures would you make to comfort them? So I'd like you to take a couple of minutes just to write down what you discovered. How do I treat a friend when that friend is going through a hard time? Maybe just wrapping up now, taking a few moments to do that. And now once again, please close your eyes for a moment. And think about some times when you were suffering in some way. It was your misfortune, your failure, your feelings of inadequacy. How do you typically respond to yourself in those kinds of situations? What would you say to yourself? What's the tone of the voice? And sometimes it's just the tone. And once again, when you're ready, please write down some of what you discovered. Okay. Is there anybody who would like to share something about what they experienced with that? Or not? We'll have some time for sharing later too, a little later in the morning. So in this exercise, Kristen Neff, the psychologist, found that about 78% of us are more compassionate to other people than we are to ourselves. Does that resonate with anybody here? About 16% are equal, about 6% are more compassionate to others, to themselves, than they are to others. And we probably know a few people like that. Now, there's an interesting, maybe it's a riddle, a puzzle in a way, the statement that comes from the program that I teach. We give ourselves compassion not to feel better, but because we feel bad. We give ourselves compassion not to feel better, but because we feel bad. When I first heard that, I was confused. What does that really mean? If you think about, if you were upset, you talked to a friend, and the first thing they did was to blame and fix the problem. You felt like, yeah, but what about my problem? I just feel like I need to talk to somebody about this. There's this part of really hearing out what's going on for somebody. It's empathic in a really good way. There's something about expressing yourself, about being heard and understood that's very powerful for us. And when that happens, we actually feel a shift. We get it off our chest. We feel almost a physical change in ourselves. And we end up feeling more ready to deal with that problem, usually, than when we started. So this ability to be with our suffering, not because we're trying to fix it, but because it's just there. It's part of our experience as a human being to suffer at times. Can we be there for that and just be open with that? That's the direction of self-compassion. Sometimes when we first we learn self-compassion, it feels very good. And this becomes our new tool to fix every problem in our life. But if we're really trying to push those problems away without actually listening to them, it just becomes, it's going to wear itself out very quickly. This ability to be with your experience, even though it's unpleasant at times, and be kind to that rather than hard on yourself, makes a world of difference. So why aren't we more self-compassionate? What's the problem? Well, we've got a lot of myths, like, if I'm self-compassionate, I'll become a selfish jerk. Is it true? There's quite a bit of literature that suggests that self-compassionate people, not surprisingly, can be more compassionate to other people. And some studies show that self-compassionate is associated with more caring and support and compromise in romantic relationships. I'll become self-indulgent. I'll just eat hot fudge sundaes all the time. Actually, people with self-compassion tend to engage in healthier behaviors. They stick with their exercise programs. They stick with their diets. They don't drink too much. They're better at stopping smoking. They see their healthcare providers. I'll wallow in self-pity if I'm kind to myself. But actually, self-compassionate people tend to be better at taking perspective. When they're distressed, they don't blow it out of proportion, but they have a way of seeing it in a more balanced way. They tend to be realistic about things, about themselves. They don't blow their own self-image up. They tend to take responsibility for their mistakes, not blame it on others. Self-compassion will make me weak, snivelly. But actually, self-compassion is associated with better abilities of coping. For example, divorce or trauma or chronic pain. And one of the interesting things that's been coming up in recent times that people who teach self-compassion have been talking about is the yin and yang of self-compassion. The yin are the things that we probably think more about compassion in general, that it's comforting and soothing, and it tends to validate our experience. But the yang part is the fierce compassion. The compassion that's courageous. It takes courage to face your difficulties. And sometimes we have to stand up, in a time of Me Too, in a time of social injustice and inequities. Self-compassion also is a matter of standing up for ourselves and for other people. So it doesn't always look like gentleness. It can be quite fierce and at times angry when it feels right. And there's the myth that, and probably one of the biggest ones is, I need to whip myself to get myself to do anything at all. Otherwise, I'll lose my motivation. How am I going to keep going if I'm not hard on myself? And probably a lot of us going through medical training learn to be hard on ourselves. So the counter to self-compassion most typically is self-criticism. How does self-criticism work? It asks, am I good enough? And what's the answer? No, I'm not. That's why I'm critical. Get better. Self-compassion is more about, what do I need? What's good for me in the long term? What's going to serve me well for happiness and health and so on? Self-criticism doesn't make you feel good. It tends to promote anxiety and depression. Self-compassion, actually one of the strongest things in the research literature, is it tends to protect against anxiety and depression. The self-critic is concerned about, did I get the A in the class? The self-compassionate person is more concerned about, did they learn what they wanted to in the class? Getting the A is a great thing too, but actually self-compassion does not lower people's standards. They still maintain those. But when self-critics fail, they're likely to get a bump down in their self-efficacy and think about, well, maybe I'm not good in math, maybe I'll never take another math class again. The self-compassionate person tends to take those failures more in stride, more looking at things as learning experiences and how to get what they need. Maybe I need a coach, maybe I need a tutor, but this was good for me to do. Self-critics would tend to be more conformist. With self-compassion, we tend to be more authentic. What's right for me? Not right for other people, but for me. They tend to be more autonomous. And there are a lot of benefits that have been seen from self-compassion, and there's a really growing literature about this. On the positive side, optimism, happiness are increased or are greater in self-compassionate people. The feeling of connectedness to others, curiosity and creativity. You know, the nice thing is if you fail with self-compassion, you're right there to help yourself and support yourself. You're never alone. You've always got a friend. You can be more forgiving. And we mentioned you can be a healthier person. I think where self-compassion really shines, though, is embracing the negative stuff that comes up in life. We can acknowledge what's there. We don't have to run away from things or fix them or make them go away. We can actually just know they're there and deal with that. And we can have more perspective on things. We don't have to catastrophize, but we can see things for what they are. And at the same time, we're not going to be critical of ourselves. We're not going to ruminate and cycle negative thoughts so that we get really depressed. And we're not going to feel isolated because we know that we feel just like other people feel and they feel like us. So we see reductions in anxiety and depression, less overwhelm from other people's distress. And in general, self-compassion has been associated with greater well-being. So I'd like to do another exercise. And in this exercise, we're going to tap into our self-compassion. So once again, I'd like you to please just close your eyes, sit comfortably in a position that lets you feel alert and supported. Just letting yourself settle in. And now please think about a recent situation that was somewhat or moderately distressing for you. Please don't take anything extreme. It was something that left you feeling upset. And see if you can get a fresh sense of that issue. Like it just happened. Especially, what were you feeling emotionally? And you may even find it helpful to label the emotion with words like anger, irritation, frustration, anxiety, sadness, whatever came up for you. See if you can feel into your sense of kindness. Kindness. And your ability to understand other people. Think about what you would say to a friend in your position. Or if it works better for you, maybe what a friend would say to you in this situation. And another possibility is to imagine an ideal friend, someone who's unconditionally accepting, wise about life, deeply kind and compassionate. Somebody who knows you intimately, your strengths and your weaknesses, who only cares about your well-being. What do you need to hear in this situation to help to bring a kind way of approaching this? See if what happened could make sense as part of the human experience. And that you're not alone in feeling the way you do. And now please just gently reorient yourself to the room. And please open your eyes. I'd like you to write a short letter to yourself, about a paragraph, from the perspective of your friend or yourself, whatever it is that you would need to convey some kindness and goodwill and support for yourself about this situation. See if it's possible to provide what you need to hear in order to feel some comfort or soothing about this stressful situation in your life. And there's no right or wrong way to do this. And don't worry if you don't finish it. You have the rest of your life to finish this letter. So please just wrap up. And So does anybody want to say anything about this? We'll have some other time to do it as well. But anything that came up? So this exercise is a really great way to bring self-compassion to a situation in your life. It's been studied as an intervention where they had people writing a compassionate letter to themselves every day for a week. They found that people's happiness was increased for 6 months, and depression was reduced and sustained at 3 months, these reductions in depression. So it's a pretty powerful thing for 1 week of writing a letter like this. So I recommend it highly. Now, there are ways that you can formally train compassion if you're so inclined. There's a course in self-compassion called Mindful Self-Compassion. Another course that's taught, it's taught widely, but it was developed at Stanford, the Stanford Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education. That's why they call it CCARE. These are 8-9-week programs that actually have shown benefits in studies. Not surprisingly, compassion and mindfulness are improved, but also improvements in happiness and life satisfaction, connectedness, reductions in anxiety, depression, worry. And I just want to, it's just... The Mindful Self-Compassion program, which is an 8-week program, had these benefits sustained at 1 year. So 8-week program, but the benefits to life factors like life satisfaction actually were maintained for a whole year when they retested people. What about compassion, self-compassion for docs and for healthcare providers? Now, Stanford does a physician wellness survey every year in recent years, and they included self-compassion in the most recent survey. So in 2016, what they found was that self-compassion was associated strongly with burnout in this sense. The people with the lowest self-compassion had the highest burnout rates, 60%. And the people with the highest self-compassion had the lowest burnout rates, about 10%. Self-compassion was the strongest predictor in the realm of personal things that people did or felt, the strongest predictor of burnout, even stronger than sleep deprivation. So this was a new finding. We started to develop a program at Stanford for self-compassion training. And that program was based on the idea that, guess what? We're really, really busy people. We knew that if we tried to get people in for a 1-hour or 2-hour training, that was never going to happen. So the basic idea was that we would have very short classes in clinics. We would go to the clinics rather than trying to get people to come to us. And we did 30 minutes a week for 8 weeks. The idea was to teach people very brief practices, not to make them meditators or to make them experts, but to just instill a mindset of compassion. What can I do in the midst of my very busy day when I, in this moment, feel some stress, feel some upset of some sort? So we taught people practices that could be done in 3 minutes or less, and hopefully even less than a minute. What we saw was improvements in self-kindness, measures of self-kindness, how people felt they related to themselves in the midst of difficulty, and also in particular skills that we taught them to evoke self-compassion. What we didn't see and didn't measure too much were improvements in things like burnout. And at this point in time, we don't really have an intervention that clearly improves burnout per se. But I think we do know that it's possible and practical to be able to help people to improve their self-compassion. So that's really good news. So I'm actually getting close to the end here. So our idea is that self-compassion is really something that is an attitude. It's an orientation in our life. And I really like this metaphor. This is a metaphor for hell. Everybody has these very long spoons they're trying to eat, but they cannot get those spoons in their mouths. You may have seen this. This is heaven. Same spoons, but we feed each other. So I think that when we're kind to each other, when we focus on what's good for all of us, and also what's good for us individually, we will do far better in this world. So this slide set, which will be available to you, have some resources. There are a lot of books that have come out recently about self-compassion, plenty of things to choose from, and also some websites. Some of these websites, particularly the first one, has a lot of self-compassion practices, guided meditations if you're interested. The second website, Kristen Neff's website, has a lot of literature about research on self-compassion. So these things are available to the public. You might also be interested, if you haven't seen it, the Being with Dying program from Upaya. This is a program specifically for people who do end-of-life care, and I think in general palliative care. It's a one-week program. And it focuses not only on compassion for patients, but also self-care and resilience for providers. So these are some resources that I hope you would find useful. And that's it. Good. Oh. Yeah, any questions? Sure. But these slides, I think, will be available for you, too. So I just want to open it up to any questions, if there's anything that comes up. Yeah. Oh. Is there a, oh, is it? Oh, I see, okay. This one?
Does that work? Do you see this kind of training early on for physicians, nurses, incorporating it more into their education?
Yeah, probably from about kindergarten on. Yeah. You know, we are seeing a little bit more of the literature on the fact that self-compassion is associated with better resilience in medical training, and probably less burnout. What's been a little bit less clear, and this is really the leap we have to make, is that some people are naturally self-compassionate, we know that, and some people are not. And what we have yet to prove really is that teaching people self-compassion will have all the benefits of having natural self-compassion. I think there's evidence that, in fact, we do get a lot of benefit if we don't have self-compassion of doing this kind of training. And I do the training with people, and I've seen a lot of people really benefit from that kind of training. So I think it's quite effective. But I personally think that one of the problems for healthcare providers is not so much the yin part of self-compassion. I think we want to develop that. But the yang part of self-compassion, the part of us that really advocates for ourselves. I think we tend to suck up a lot. And I think that part of that compassion that's going to really make a difference in the healthcare system is the fierce self-compassion of really negotiating for our own needs. Or maybe, you know, some people, maybe medicine wasn't the right choice for them. Maybe they're trying to fit themselves into something that's not going to ever be self-compassionate. So I think self-compassion opens up a can of worms for us in a certain way, but I think it's a good can of worms to open up. I think we have to be very free with the possibilities for what is going to be in our best interest, what's going to help us thrive in the world. And I think if we do that more at every stage, we'll probably find that it will help us to practice in a much healthier environment. Yeah. Do you want to use this? Oh, I'm sorry? Oh, do you want to go?
Just a quick question, and I may have missed it. What are the tools that you use to measure self-compassion, pre and post? Because you're showing data, but what tools do you use? Yeah.
There are standard tools. Kristen Neff actually developed probably the most standard scales of self-compassion, and they're widely used. There are some short and longer versions of those. Yeah.
Hi, I'm wondering if you can share the exercises that you'd used with the physicians in-house. I took the C-Care. I highly recommend anybody that lives in this area to go to Stanford and take the 8-week class. And then we were able to bring it back and have trainers come to our hospice program at Mission
nice.
Hospice. For 3 years, we had people coming in and teaching the 8-week class, but over time it became inaccessible just because of the 2 hours for 8 weeks. So hearing about a 30-minute class that people could come in and take, I'd be really interested in knowing about that resource, if that's something that you're willing to share or could share.
We don't have it in a form that's really for kind of general consumption, but I'd be happy to talk with you about.
Okay, or if a trainer, C-Care trainer could come in and deliver that.
Yeah, it's not C-Care.
Oh, okay, okay,
Yeah.
we can talk after though.
Yeah. You want to come up?
I think one of the things that you showed in one of your slides was about anger.
Mm-hmm.
And recently NPR did a show on how we don't have many subtleties around how we think about anger. So when we say we're angry, we think it's one thing, but actually anger has a lot of different qualities to it. And I think it's a really strong feedback mechanism, and one of the myths I think about self-compassion is that we approach everything really kindly. And we don't know what to do with our anger, and we don't know what to do with conflict. So something that I've been trying to do lately with my anger is to ask myself, is this really anger? Or is there fear here? Is there self-preservation? Is there some intelligence that's trying to come out here? And I do think that people who are not familiar with self-compassion practices can be under the illusion that self-compassion is a soft process. And from all the work that I've done around meta-practice and compassion, it's not soft. It's rigorous. It's a warrior path, and you have to face in to your edges in a way that is fearless. So I just wanted to name that because I think one of the ways that we're hard on ourselves is that we think we should be so good, and we're not.
Actually, you are so good. I think that's true. But we find these things that don't fit our image, of course, and that's a source of problems. Yeah. Oh.
So what strikes me is, listening to your talk, what about parenting? This just says all the things we need to do. What do we tell our children? How do we think about it differently? It just from educators to parenting, it's a different way to think, and to share our knowledge with our children.
Yeah. Wow, that's a big topic. I will say, one thing that's interesting is that now the self-compassion, there's a version of it that's being given for teenagers, and hopefully it'll just keep, coming down and down. And I think, the message, I think an important part of the self-compassion message is how do we motivate ourselves? Because so often we think in terms of kind of carrots and sticks. We don't sort of trust that we can motivate ourselves in a very kind way based on our passion for things, where we really are moved to. We have very natural drives to do certain things, and certain things we're not inclined to do. And we judge ourselves so much that anything that deviates from some kind of preconceived plan meets with a lot of criticism and a lot of resistance. If we could give ourselves a lot more kindness, I think we would naturally sort out what things attract us and what things don't. And I think we would move a lot more naturally through life. That's my personal sense. I personally came on self-compassion a few years ago. I had meditated for many, many years, and I was in an emotionally trying time. I was leaving a long-time practice, and I came across self-compassion. It was very transformational because I realized that I just had a lot of expectations for what I was supposed to do or what I was supposed to be, and when I didn't meet those expectations, it was quite painful. And self-compassion basically gave me a way to look at experience without the judgment. I think judgment, when you take away judgment, just taking away your judgment about things makes you a kinder person. I think when we just don't judge so much, things lighten up, and we find that it's just easier to go through life. And life tends to teach us what it wants us to do. And when we do those things, when we go and kind of go with the flow of things, with this kindness as a kind of medium, it's amazing how well things will work out. And it makes us kinder to other people too. They start to notice. So I think it's a very powerful thing to see. You know, we have an exercise in the program that I teach, which is finding a compassionate voice. Our voice may be one of criticism. And maybe that's a well-meaning thing. We learned that at some point in our life. We may have picked it up from our caregivers. This is what we've been taught, and this is what we do. But at least what it has in mind for us. But then we can kind of depart from that and say, how could I motivate myself with kindness? What would that look like? You know, instead of kicking ourselves out the door to exercise, what would it be like if I said, you know, what's in my best interest right now? Am I forcing myself to do this, or could I encourage myself to do this in a way that feels better to me? And we do that kind of exercise, and people generally can find ways to look at their experience and say, yeah, I think I could do this without being so hard on myself. Maybe I would do less of it. Maybe I would make it easier at the beginning. There are just so many different options, but usually when we're kind to ourselves, more options appear. When we're hard on ourselves, fewer options appear. So I think the kinder we are, the more the world really opens up, and we find lots of things that just were not even available to us to do.
Dr. Horowitz, thank you. One quick question regarding empathic distress versus compassion fatigue. Would you mind sharing that a little bit? I've heard many different perspectives on that. I would love your thoughts on maybe teasing the difference of those out. I have one friend who says compassion fatigue is really such thing, because when you think about it, I love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, this is something that's come up. This idea that compassion doesn't fatigue people if it's really compassion. I think one way to understand it, if I bump my knee, it'd be like, ooh, and everybody in the room, or most of you would, you know, at some level there'll be a little cringe. That would be actually emotional empathy. When you see somebody getting hurt and you feel that response, that is emotional empathy. In that moment, you are aware of your own suffering, your own pain that's associated with that experience. But if you see the other person really having some difficulty, you begin to shift. Instead of being self-focused, you become more other-focused. That other-focusing, you say, oh, are you okay? You're already becoming concerned. That's empathic concern. Empathic concern over 30, 40 years has been strongly associated in research with altruism. When we have concern of that type, we are more likely to act altruistically or compassionately. And then we end up with, what can I do for you? So we move from this self-focus to this other focus. This change is the change from empathic distress to compassion. Now, typically for us, it happens extremely quickly. But if we don't do that, if we get more upset about what we're experiencing, And sometimes we don't think of it, it's all about me, but we feel the pain in a very personal way. That is going to lead to more distress. If we are more focused on the other person's situation with concern, we will tend to be more compassionate. I believe that compassion training tends to make us do that shift of moving towards the other person's situation. And amazingly, when we do that, our own distress tends to reduce. So I think there is a connection. I don't think we fully understand it scientifically, but I think we've experienced that probably. We have to have a little bit of distress, a little bit of emotional connection with the person, but just enough to trigger off our compassion. And from there, we don't need to be feeling bad. We want to feel the good quality of compassion, which is a very, it really motivates us, really draws us in, really makes us want to do more of it. So that's the direction I think we want to go, and the direction that helps to probably prevent, to some degree, the burnout of empathic distress.
I just wanted to say that it appears that, to me, that our ability for self-compassion increases with age, and naturally with age, and that the wisdom we associate with old age is actually self-compassion and kindness and self-acceptance, and these things kick in when we're able to step back a bit in old age and we're not under as much stress parenting and grueling work schedules, and we find that we're able to mediate our stressors in different ways, and all the tools and qualities of self-compassion are, to me, associated with the wisdom of old age. They're equal. That's what,
Yeah.
and I just wanted to, so I think it's something to look forward to. Oh.
I recommend getting older. I really. Yeah, we're actually out of time, and we do have a session at 11 where we can talk more about self-compassion, but thank you very much for your attention.